Hello, and welcome to this week's Qredible Live broadcast. As always, I'm here with our CEO and Chairman, Brian Fitzpatrick, and this week we are joined by Ken Fichtler. Ken is the founder and CEO at Gaize, the world's most accurate drug impairment detection technology. He's here today to discuss how technology can support safe cannabis legalization. Thank you for being here with us today, Ken. To get us started, could you tell us a little bit more about your background and the work that you're currently doing?
Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks so much for having me on. It's great to be here. So again, my name is Ken Fichtler. I'm the founder and CEO of Gaize. And what we've created is an impairment detection technology that relies on eye movement, much in the same way that law enforcement drug recognition experts try to analyze eye movement and other characteristics to understand impairment. What's great about our technology is that understanding eye movement is very predictive of what's happening in the brain. And so we have sort of a direct line of communication and understanding to where the body is and how it's responding to a chemical or if it's experiencing sobriety as well.
That's awesome. I've been a huge advocate of the federal legalization of cannabis, and the work that Qredible is doing is really about bringing safety and transparency there. And I really believe that it's really important to emphasize that safety has to be a top priority in this rapidly growing industry. And the cannabis sector, I mean, like any emerging market, requires, very careful consideration of quality and safety standards. And, I remember back when I first started really looking at this market in earnest in 2018 and 19, I started to sort of predict that we're going to witness some problems relative to safety. And, it's interesting that I was thinking about all the product safety and all the hazards, that come up from all the mycotoxins and lead and, just the fact that we lack quality standards, in the industry. But, I really wasn't thinking about it. Like, it didn't come into my mind that we've got a whole nother issue relative to usage and misusage and literally impairment. So it really speaks to the vision and mission that you're covering that side. And the great work that you and your team at Gaize are doing, you're addressing this impairment aspect of cannabis safety, which, frankly, it's timely, it's critical, and it's badly needed. And one of the things that I was looking at, because it sort of begs the question, like, what's the problem? As an entrepreneur, we want to solve problems, right? What's the problem that's going on? And I was really shocked to see that the rise in cannabis-related traffic deaths, and I think it was back the year I graduated high school in 1987. I'm showing my age now, but in 87 there was a huge Amtrak derailment, and 16 people were killed in that. And it turns out that the conductor or the engineer was high on marijuana, and 16 people were killed as a result of that. And that really led into a lot of the safety standards that for drug testing. But we have this issue, I think, because, drug testing in the typical ways, back in 87, marijuana wasn't legal, but back then it was, if you have it in your bloodstream, but doesn't that last a while? So it's not really a good predictor. How does your device really solve for this in getting, sort of an accurate impairment test?
Yeah, and thanks for that framing. It's really important. And that was the kind of most well-known accident that can be directly related to cannabis impairment. And so the dynamics, the way that cannabis is metabolized in the body, I think most people are familiar with the idea that you can be positive on a THC test for a lot longer than the window of impairment. So, we've all heard of people that are positive on a urinalysis screening for weeks or positive on an oral fluid saliva test for a couple days. These are all sort of emblematic of the problem of just looking at THC in the body and attempting to understand what's going on based on that. So it's very different from how alcohol works in the body. Alcohol, you can look at the amount that's experienced and or the amount that's in the body, and you can, with some level of precision, understand what amount of impairment is happening as a result. And it turns out that cannabis and almost every other drug does not behave the same way in the body. You have to look at how the body's actually responding rather than the amount of the substance that's in the body. And so that's why there's no established per se limit. That's like the 0.08 for alcohol. There's no established per se limit for cannabis. And scientists have studied this issue and very conclusively come to the determination that there is no specific amount of THC in the body that can be predictive of impairment. And so when I found out about that, I was the director of economic development for the state of Montana, and I was trying to understand what would the impacts to the state be if we were to legalize recreational cannabis. And so as I studied this issue, it became clear that we don't have any tools that are able to detect impairment. And so that creates a really challenging safety issue for businesses and for law enforcement. And so when I realized the kind of scope of the problem and the opportunity in the market, that was when I decided I was going to found this company. What our product does is, rather than look for the amount of the chemical of the THC in the body, we're looking at how the body's actually responding. Again, so we're looking at eye movement. And eye movement has been utilized by drug recognition expert police officers with a relatively high degree of accuracy. It's pretty impressive, actually, what these officers can do. And they're able to detect impairment and then decide what category of drug is causing that impairment. Mm-hmm. So by relying on those same ocular tests, we have a lot of great foundation for our technology. There's a huge amount of research that's gone into those tests. They've been used in court in almost every state, or they've been used in court in almost 50 states. And drug recognition experts are considered experts by almost every court in the United States. So there's a huge degree of sort of defensibility that comes into our product just by virtue of utilizing these same tests. And so we have a very high degree of certainty that what we can detect is cannabis impairment. And that's, I think, a really important thing as we look at how are we going to fairly and accurately treat cannabis users, because what's happening today is fundamentally unfair. We cannot try to police cannabis users based just on measuring THC in the body. That's just not the way it works.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, like, when I was looking at a lot of the statistics about, sort of cannabis related deaths, and you can see there's a rise, right, in cannabis related traffic deaths. And I think some of the numbers I saw is that the percentage of car crashes has gone from like 9% in 2018, to 22% in 2000, and now they're claiming it's close to 25%. But the question is, how do they know?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'll caution you on those statistics, because what they're doing is in a basically in a forensic setting, they're looking at what chemicals did this person have in their body after a fatal accident. There's always kind of a forensic screening that happens. And so since THC can linger in the body for so long since the last use, I would caution you not to conflate, and the federal government is unfortunately doing this. They're conflating THC in the body to some potential causal effect on that crash, which is not necessarily true. There was just THC in the body. It could have been there from 2 days ago or 3 weeks ago. We don't know.
Yeah, and I think they're correlating it just because of the increase in emergency room visits, where they're seeing states that have legalization, they're looking at it in Canada, and so, but they are making a lot of assumptions, right? Yep. And there's no way to truly correlate. I think that's what you're saying, is you don't know unless you're actually doing these scientific tests that actually can make sense. And that makes a lot of sense to me. So how can this change sort of the impact in the workplace as well? We're talking about sort of traffic deaths and impairment, for driving, that these tests could be used by law enforcement, but what about the workplace, and how does that sort of change the workplace? Because right now it's like in states where it's legal, it's like, it's kind of like you allow it, but the drug test only shows, like you were saying before, if it's in the bloodstream. Right. But how does this change in a workplace drug testing program?
Yeah, and the situation you're describing is really a challenge for safety sensitive workplaces across the board, because the rate of utilization of cannabis has certainly increased in the last few years, as you pointed to. There was a study that came out, I think last year, or maybe it was this year, that showing that 22% of Americans had utilized THC in the last year. So that's a huge portion of the population. And from a business's perspective, they have to employ these people. They have to figure out, how do we safely employ cannabis users? And so a lot of workplaces have said, well, we're just going to drop THC testing because we can't have people that are getting sort of en masse screened out of our hiring process. We need to staff up. We need to be able to meet our expectations for our customers and for the market or whatever. And so what our product does is it allows them to detect current impairment or impairment as it's being experienced rather than just prior use, which is what every other drug test that looks at chemicals in the body does. And so we have a lot of really impressive safety sensitive customers on we've got quite a number of Fortune 500 companies that are using our product today. And what they're able to do with our technology is find out, is someone experiencing impairment in the moment where it actually matters, not did they get high last night or over the weekend.
Yeah, and it's so is it all on the eye movement? Is it have nothing to do with like a breathalyzer or any
Correct.
of that?
Yeah. So everything that our product does is looking at, we conduct 6 different eye movement tests, basically. And in the course of those, we can extract certain indicators of impairment, both known to law enforcement and things that we have discovered that are new and novel. And so our product picks up on those. We report that back to our customers instantly. And so our product is very, very rapid, very easy to use. We ask that our customers actually confirm with a chemical test, though, before they take any adverse action. And that's because we think that creates the largest body of evidence that's possible in any given situation to really understand what's happening here. We don't want someone to, as an example with a prescription drug, have a prescription and show signs of impairment because they accidentally overused or something and then face some termination action. We need to understand the entirety of that situation and be able to, understand the context that's happening and not just be as black and white as I think, most chemical tests are.
Now, are these tools that eventually you see used in the field through law enforcement like they would a breathalyzer?
Yeah. Yeah. So, our technology slots nicely in where the portable breath test does. So that's the small handheld portable breathalyzers that law enforcement use on the side of the road. So in this, as an example, so if someone was to blow a 0 on a portable breath test, still seems to be impaired by the officer, they could utilize the Gaize headset and find out, is this person showing signs of impairment? And again, since we're utilizing the same tests as the drug recognition experts, which are the highest trained law enforcement officials at detecting drug impairment, they can have a high degree of certainty that, one, they're capturing useful evidence from someone utilizing tests that are well known and understood. And then they're getting kind of an instant read of what's happening with this person, whereas most officers don't have that level of expertise and certainly can't conduct these sorts of tests in the field. Our product is able to provide that certainty.
Yeah, and I would imagine, like you were talking about the Fortune 500 companies, that this has to be a benefit to the HR and legal department as well, because they really don't have any way to really determine if the person was truly impaired, without these tests. They're like, oh yeah, well, I smoked it a week ago. I didn't come to work high.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and you can see any number of news stories that's come out about businesses that are actually getting in trouble because they weren't able to demonstrate impairment and took an adverse employment action. So, in that case, basically they're penalizing someone from using a legal substance safely and responsibly, potentially. And so that's not, I think what any business wants to do. And it's certainly not the situation that was envisioned by voters when they decided to legalize cannabis.
Right.
So introducing impairment technology is really, really fundamental to getting this right.
Yeah, and I think so. So obviously, it solves sort of an HR and legal issue, but imperatively, it solves workplace safety. I mean, you don't want the dude driving the forklift in your, in your warehouse to be high, right? So I would imagine that's critical. And then, obviously, somebody who is impaired isn't going to perform in the same way as if they were not. So I think it goes beyond sort of a safety issue, but I would imagine these are all part of the value props when you're talking to these Fortune 500 companies.
Yeah, there's a huge ROI to be found in terms of not only are you potentially conducting fewer chemical tests, which are pretty expensive to do, but you can also imagine the amount of productivity that we can gain by having fewer people show up to work high, and then just the time required to conduct a lab confirmed chemical test is. You're taking someone off site, you're having them tested, then they're sitting on the sidelines for a week while you wait for results. And so we can eliminate all of that. So it's a really big efficiency improvement in the whole process.
Well, I know my business partner, Rick, he he doesn't like dealing with commercial insurance companies because they always seem to raise the rates. And I would imagine with, these commercial liability policies that have to be in place, I wonder if there's an insurance benefit as well.
Absolutely. We have some really great insurance partners that are, both in pilot phase and then rolling this out to their customers. And the idea there is they're seeing a lot of challenges with the businesses that they insure that are in legal states and illegal states. But primarily, this is a problem related to legalization of cannabis and how that impacts efficiency and claims and all that. And so we are a really attractive option for these insurers when they look at how are we going to reduce the number of claims and have, actually keep our rates affordable by our customers as well. So it's a huge advantage to insurers, and we've got some really amazing insurance partners already.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Credible's been very focused on the product safety. And we'll talk a little bit about what I think the responsibilities are now for the entire industry. But I really see that if we have a safer industry from a product perspective, right, which is what we're focusing on. So we're focusing on making sure that companies are following standards, that are doing all the things through standard operating procedures and testing standards, et cetera, and giving them all the technology to reduce the cost of that compliance. That's on the product side, but then there's really, the responsibility on the use side itself. And I think that also helps, the industry grow and move towards federal legalization, because
100%.
The more of these stories we hear about, car crashes or workplace safety issues, and they are tied back to cannabis, that's going to throw a wrench in the system entirely. So I think it's imperative to the growth, the proper growth and transparency, the efficacy of the industry, that there's not only the responsibility on the company side, but there's also the responsibility on the user side. And that's sort of one of the things I wanted to drill into a little bit is kind of talk about the consumers.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it important from a consumer perspective? And, so how does impairment work in the body, and what danger does it pose to workers, and why should they be focused on this?
Yeah, and it's a great question. There's this pervasive opinion that people are safer drivers when they're high, or that they're safer workers when they're high, and that's just simply not true. The statistics show that you're at least 2.1 times more likely to crash when you're high than when you're not. So that has been well established by science, and I would encourage anyone who is interested to either reach out to us or look up those studies on your own. We're happy to provide those. It's been well studied at this point, and I want to try to put that issue to bed because it's a very, very common misperception. And, really the way that cannabis impairment manifests in the body is a couple things. Your reaction time is going to be slower. Your divided attention is going to be less good. And so that is, can I kind of hold two things in my mind at the same time? Am I going the speed I'm supposed to be, and am I watching for pedestrians? In a workplace context, that might be, am I remembering to keep my sleeve away from the, big wheel that's operating next to me and push the button, or, whatever that looks like. And then there's short-term memory issues and, kind of generalized lack of coordination, things like that. And so these are really the primary ways that impairment manifests. At much higher levels, you can get some other challenges, but, fundamentally from like a driving and workplace safety standpoint, reaction time, kind of general coordination skills, and then divided attention memory are kind of the primary challenges.
Yeah. And I tell you, I'm a cannabis user only in the form of a gummy to help me sleep at night, or if my back flares up, and I'm not working, if it's during the weekend. But I remember it wasn't that long ago where I took a gummy because I normally about an hour before bedtime, and our daughter called, and my wife said, "Oh, we have to go help her with something. She has an issue with her car." I'm like, "Well, I can't drive. I'm not, there's no way I'm driving, because I can feel it. I mean, I can just feel it getting out of bed to go to the restroom. I'm unsteady. I mean, there's no way I would operate a motor vehicle or any heavy machinery or anything like that. Now, unfortunately, in the statistics and the things that you're talking about, two times more likely, you were saying, very sadly, we had a family friend who lost their son, out driving it very early in the morning after sort of a night of imbibing in cannabis and marijuana. And, they got the munchies. They wanted to go get something to eat. And lo and behold, he was killed. It was, a terrible story. But, these are the kind of stories that your technology is really, I think helping to avoid, which is critically important. So I think that there's sort of I see this as a two-way street, right? I see that there's a responsibility from the company side, from the industry side.
Mm-hmm.
That's not just about product safety. It starts with product safety. So they have to be responsible, from the growers to the manufacturers and distributors. I believe that they bear the primary responsibility for ensuring product safety, but also usage safety from the standpoint of education, right? On how do we educate consumers about safe and responsible usage, and I haven't seen really any of that, right? And there's and by the way, I think that because we're not federally legal, it limits the amount of research we can do on things like dosing and how your body responds depending on your endocannabinoid system. And so it's not totally the fault of the industry, because there's not a lot of research going on, but I haven't seen it, and it's going to have to happen from my perspective. There's going to have to be safety and education guidance. And I also believe that, there's going to have to be more rigorous quality control measures that adhere towards these regulatory standards, and companies must prioritize these things. So I think that there's a side from the company side. I think that the government should be able to do research and put positive messages out about responsible usage. I am starting to see billboards in various states, like here in New Jersey. You're seeing the billboards that high driving is basically impaired driving.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you'll get a DUI ticket for that. But then it was funny. I saw that this morning on the way from the gym. Knew I was talking to you this afternoon. I'm like, how do they know? It always goes.
Yeah, and that's the challenge. There was a study that came out in 23 that showed that law enforcement officers utilizing the standardized field sobriety test, which are kind of a very abbreviated version of the drug recognition expert process, had a 49% false positive rate at detecting cannabis impaired drivers.
Wow.
So that's terrible. And what I think I want the cannabis users in the audience to kind of hold in their mind is that chemical tests that are being utilized to police impaired driving, or these standardized field sobriety tests, are just simply not sensitive to cannabis impairment. And there's a real challenge here that we have to solve.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Got to move towards a safe and accurate technique at detecting actual impairment, or we're going to risk falsely penalizing people who are behaving appropriately. And that's not what we want to do.
Yeah, I can imagine we're going to see, more of these groups, even nonprofit groups, popping up, talking about these things, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, and the kind of research and education and good work that they're doing about the misuse of alcohol, while driving. And I think that so there is an obligation as a community and an industry to really do this, but there's also an obligation from the consumer perspective. I really believe that. I mean, like, it's amazing to me that everybody just says, oh, well, weed is legal in my state, so it's safe. And, no, I mean, we're starting to read things just about the safety of the product itself. And now, from the standpoint of impairment, companies, first of all, shouldn't be relying on attractive packaging or marketing or, those types of things to choose their products, and a lot of times, if you look at, and this was prevalent in the CBD industry, where they think the big companies, are the safest ones, but we've seen that's not always the case, either. So, bigger is not necessarily better. So through research, it's essential, for any consumer to do their research, not only on the quality of the product, but also on this responsible consumption. So what are your thoughts about how consumers can really educate themselves and understand tolerance levels, and
Yeah.
how might that work?
It's a great question. And to speak to the industry side first, there's the Drink Responsibly campaign, which has been broadly funded by alcohol companies. There is no corollary to for cannabis, and I think that's a huge mistake that the industry is making right now. You're sort of bumbling into a situation where you're going to invite regulation that you do not want. So taking this seriously and treating this issue as something that we have to work together to solve, I think, is absolutely critical. And
that's a great thought, but what they're going to say is, well, they don't even let us advertise on
yeah, I mean, and to be fair, the lack of banking, the lack of advertising, the inability to really operate as a normal business in this space is crazy. And I hope that we can get this figured out at some point at the federal level. If you look at there's a great chart of societal harm from each drug that's out there that you can look up, and alcohol is very near the top and cannabis is very near the bottom. So simply from a data perspective, it certainly makes sense for cannabis to be legal. And I think that that is certainly the direction that the country is trending. And so I think the sooner we can wrap our minds around that and accept that eventuality, the better off we can all be. And then we can move forward in understanding how do we regulate this in a way that's actually going to make sense? How do we tackle some of these societal issues like impaired driving and impaired working? How do we make sure that the products that people are consuming are actually safe and not contaminated? All super important issues that get solved.
That's a mic drop moment right there. And you just said it really, really well. Totally agree with that. And it's interesting, by not going federal, it's actually making the industry less safe.
Yeah. What I like to, I think everyone was expecting Florida's recreational ballot initiative to pass. And because of the way that they count in Florida, that didn't happen. They have to have 60% of the vote instead of 50% of the vote to pass a ballot initiative. So it narrowly missed being passed. But what I was telling some of our customers and prospects in Florida in the next couple of days was, you've got the exact same amount of weed, but none of the tax revenue to deal with it. So
that's very true, and a great point. So these places where it's not legal, do you think people are not smoking weed?
Exactly.
So it's crazy. It's so funny, man. I hate to say it, but fortunately my kids were really good in growing up and through high school, but they would always tell me, "Oh, that guy sells weed. That guy sells weed." And I'm like, "Boy, you got a whole distribution network right at your high school." And they're like, "Yeah." That black market does not go away. So it will reduce and go away if we continue to move this towards safety, and we do the right things and not tax them so much that they can't spend money on safety. So really, I think the wrap up there and the corollary is, by addressing both industry and consumer responsibilities, I think the cannabis industry can work towards truly creating a safer, more informed and responsible market where everybody's boat's going to lift higher, and most important, consumers are going to be safer. Mm-hmm. So, and that dual approach, I think, is absolutely critical. So, Ken, why don't you tell people how they can get in touch with you and learn more about what you're doing? Because our listeners are, running some of these companies, and these are important issues to them. So let's talk about how they can learn more about you and get in touch with you.
Yeah, you bet. So our company is Gaize.ai, Gaize.ai. And then my email is ken@gaize.ai. So pretty simple. And I'd be more than happy to chat with anyone. I have, somewhat adversarial conversations pretty regularly, and I'm typically able to find common ground with people. So I'm always happy to talk with someone who disagrees with something I've said, or, some opinion that I may have espoused. I think fundamentally, though, I would love to talk to, industry members that are interested in establishing some sort of a safe driving program, or trying to lean in and address sort of consumer safety and responsible use. Anything like that, we're more than happy to engage with, and would love to hear from people.
I think that's a great idea, and I think it has to happen. It absolutely has to happen. So, that's absolutely great to hear. So, thank you, Ken. And for our listeners, next Friday on Qredible Live is the day after Thanksgiving. So if you don't feel like fighting the long lines of Black Friday, you can stay home and enjoy your lingering turkey coma that we all go into after Thanksgiving. And join us live next Friday at 12 noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern. And we're going to welcome Mike Lamuto. Is that right, Taylor? Mike Lamuto, right? So we'll be talking about building a bridge between the businesses, the community, and the regulators, and so that we can find common ground and advance this industry in a positive way, which is all what we're trying to do, right? I mean, Ken, if you think about it, that's what you're trying to do.
100%.
You're trying to bring safety to this industry, and you're trying to bridge that gap that's important between everybody in the community. So, Ken, thanks so much for joining us. Keep up the great work you're doing. And we got to stay in touch to see how things are moving along. And I'm going to find some of those people that need to talk to you about this product, but also driving those safety campaigns. So that's it for this week. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next Friday.